Welcome back to another fantastic, exciting edition of Macros Inc. Live. We are super excited to be bringing this one to you today. This one's going to be all about insulin resistance. But before I get started, Brad doesn't know this, but I have something exciting for him to try as part of our cold opening, which we sometimes do, which is usually unrelated to the topic at hand, but we like to throw a wrench in every once in a while. So here's what I've got. For those of you that don't know, Brad has a PhD, and he has a PhD in biostatistics, I believe. Is that right, Bradley?
No, I have
You have a background in biostatistics.
yes, but I have not
Okay,
used it in years now at this point. But yes.
perfect. I'm even happier that I've chosen to go this route. So I have a few questions here that we're going to test your knowledge on biostatistics, and we'll see how many you get right. Okay, so you're gonna have to reach deep into that bucket of knowledge in your head and
I'm
see
gonna
if you get
ruin
these
the
right.
credibility of this show in the first 90 seconds.
It's all up to you, buddy. It's all up to you. What does the p-value represent in hypothesis testing?
P-value represents the probability that the data would fall the way it falls if the null hypothesis were true.
Okay, perfect. Nailed it. What statistical group would be most appropriate for comparing survival times between two treatment groups? The chi-square test, I think it's the Kaplan-Meier test, the Cox proportional hazards model, or ANOVA?
So the Cox proportional hazard model is an accelerated failure time model. You use that primarily in survival analysis.
Mhm.
You'll often see when you look at a paper, you'll see two things. You'll see a Cox proportional hazard model, which gives
Okay.
you the hazard ratio, but you'll see a Kaplan-Meier curve, which is kind of the best way to visualize what that looks like.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, you pretty much nailed it. I got just three more. We'll make them quick. But in linear regression, what assumption is made about the residuals? They are uniformly distributed. They're normally distributed with constant variance. They are skewed right, or they have increasing variance.
So they're normally distributed.
Dude, you're 3 for 3. Two
I
more
know.
to go.
Yeah.
What is multicollinearity? I think I said it right. Multicollinearity.
Multicollinearity.
Collinearity, excuse me, thank you. And why is it a problem in regression analysis? Is it because predictors are unrelated, reducing the model's power? Predictors are highly correlated, inflating standard errors. The outcome variable is categorical, or data are collected over time.
So multicollinear, it's B, right? I think that's
Okay. Yes. Yep. You're
so
right.
basically multicollinearity is like if you're, let's say you're looking at a model and you're looking at the risk of blood pressure on cardiovascular outcomes, and you include both systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and mean arterial pressure, right?
Yeah.
Those all explain the same physiological phenomena,
Mhm.
slightly differently, but basically the same. And mean arterial pressure is also it's a variable that's derived from systolic and diastolic blood pressure, right? So what you're getting is three variables are used to explain the same thing in a model. So you get like it just kind of makes it really muddy to determine what's actually going on. And what you'll often see in really good papers is you can actually look at there's a statistic called the variance inflation factor, VIF, that's reported in some papers that will tell you how much multicollinearity there is. So I published a paper on God, this was like 2014, 2015, and it was a statistical model about like biomarkers for predicting an outcome, and we reported things like variance inflation factors and multicollinearity. So that's what you should do in a multivariate paper.
Cool. I got just one more here for you. In the context of multiple comparisons, what does the Bonferroni correction aim to control? Is it type 2 error rate,
Experiment
type
wise.
1 error rate, false negative rate, or standard deviation?
Well, it's what it's really doing is it is controlling experiment wise error. So it is the like a false positive is what it's really testing for. Because here's what happens. Like let's say your p value, you set it, or your alpha, you set at 0.05, right? Which is your significance value. if you run 100 tests, like let's say you run 100 comparisons, you're likely to find something statistically significant because you've just measured a bunch of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a Bonferroni correction is a very simple way to do it. And basically it's like, hey, I'm going to take my alpha value, 0.05, and I'm going to divide it by the number of comparisons. So it'd be 100. So your actual true statistical significance then would be 0.00.
The result of that.
Yeah.
Right. The result of the division. Gotcha. There you have it, ladies and
Other
gentlemen.
ones, there's a bunch of other corrections you can do. But
I think you just went 5 for 5. So faith in the reliability of our podcasts remains, Bradley. See, he knows what he's talking about. So, all right. Well, that was, there are more questions I'll have to ask you some other time. But in the interest of getting on with it, we are going to talk about a really, I do like this topic.
Professors would be so proud. I should get my graduate certificate and I should put it up for the next show. I'll just put it right there that says statistical science.
Well, if you'd like, when I go to edit this in post and put it up on our podcast, I can, if you give me their names, I can email this section, just this section of the podcast, and say, I want you guys to know, here's how Brad did.
Yes.
So we are going to talk about insulin resistance today. That is the topic at hand. And it's a big one that a lot of people don't understand. We've talked about it before, but Brad has a background in all of this stuff. He did a lot of research on diabetes, and so he knows a thing or two about insulin resistance, you could say. So we're going to dive into that. I know it's come up a couple times in the group. So we'll talk about, what is insulin resistance? Do you have it? Do you have to worry about it? How do you avoid getting it? If you are insulin resistant, what do you do? What can you do? How does this affect your life? Does it affect the way you have to eat? So we're going to dive into a bunch of stuff, hopefully cover all of that. And then at the end, if you guys have any questions, or if you have questions throughout the show, drop them in the comments. We're happy to answer. So first, why let's talk about the benefits of understanding the topic. Like why should we even care in the first place, right? Just take us into that. Like, how does this help understanding what this is?
So there's a couple of reasons why I think people, the more they understand about this, I think the better they will do on their kind of health wellness journey for a couple of reasons. One is insulin resistance affects a lot more people than we think, right? Like I think it's 10% of the adult population in the US has type 2 diabetes. I can't remember the exact percentage of people with pre-diabetes, et cetera, but it's probably close to 20-25% of the US population. And what you're going to learn,
that's definitely higher than I would have thought. But
what you're going to learn today is the symptoms of insulin resistance, which is usually elevated blood sugar, is delayed. So you actually start to experience these things before you see symptoms. So that's the first thing. It's just a lot of people are affected by this. Two, it definitely has an impact on your overall metabolism health and your risk for chronic disease. And three, most people have such a big misunderstanding about it that they do the wrong things to try to address it. Like they just do the fundamentally, I mean, it's not technically incorrect, but it doesn't really help solve the problem. So that's why I think it's important, those three things.
And I think that when you say people, do the things that are like the wrong things, do you think that's just out of ignorance? Like not in a disrespectful way, they just don't understand, or just like,
well, I think it's because they've just been told the wrong things.
Well, that right. Okay.
And it's not ignorance in the fact that
they don't know what they don't know.
They don't know. It's that they've been told the wrong things. Like it is.
Okay. So that's,
yeah.
Yeah.
It's like if I told
think that's a different, a good differentiation to point out.
Yeah. It's like if I told you gravity was like a force like electricity instead of the shape of space. Like it's just wrong. Like
right. It's wrong. Yeah.
It means. And a lot of it's just because we haven't done a good job of teaching people.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So what we well, and I also think part of the one of the benefits is you can have, well, even more, even on a deeper level. Have you ever heard the phrase "there's no knowledge that is not power"? Like it's, I don't remember who said it, but it's basically more knowledge can never do you harm, right? So I think it's just in general, even if you're not someone who's at risk for this, I think just knowing is beneficial, because why wouldn't you want to be more educated on, different topics? So I think we're also going to dive into uh, people obviously understand that what they eat matters and has an impact on insulin resistance. But I definitely want to, throughout the show, or when we get to it, when we can, just highlighting how important exercise is to it as well, and how that affects your risk. So, anyways, but let's dive in. So, unless you had another place in mind to start, I wanted to just first of all, uh, now that we've established that, let's dive into what is insulin. If we were talking about insulin resistance, I think we first need to tell people and clear up what is insulin. I mean, we know it's a hormone. It's produced by the pancreas. It helps shuttle the nutrients in your blood into the cells of your body so that they can be metabolized for energy. I mean, I know that's how I would describe it on a high level, but what is, like, to just take us into that, let's get into what is insulin and like its role in the body.
Yeah. So insulin is a hormone that our body produces, and a lot of times it's fairly misunderstood, because we often think about it as it just pushes glucose into our cells.
Yeah, like we
And
think
it's
of
a
it as a
little
negative thing.
it's a little more complicated than that. So what it really does is it helps kind of coordinate our metabolism, and it also sends our body the signal of that we have just consumed food. Right? So it's a switch of being in a fed or fasted state, and it helps our body direct nutrients where they need to go. So when you haven't eaten in a while, you have fairly low levels of insulin in your blood, and you have a little bit higher levels of glucagon in your blood, which is kind of the opposite hormone. Insulin's job is to do a few things. When insulin is present, it helps shuttle nutrients, both carbohydrates and fatty acids, into your peripheral tissue. So your muscles, your fat cells, etc. When insulin is low, your body doesn't take up as much nutrients from circulation, because it's like, hey, I don't need to take up a lot because there's not a lot present at the moment, right? Because I haven't eaten in a while. Glucagon is a little bit of the opposite. So glucagon tells your body, hey, I haven't eaten in a while, but I need to maintain my blood sugar at a certain level. So glucagon is higher when you haven't eaten in a while or you have low blood sugar. And it tells your liver to pump out more glucose so you can maintain blood glucose levels, right?
Right. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Insulin also has an effect on glucagon, in that when insulin is working properly, it kind of suppresses the effect of glucagon. So it tells your liver, hey, we've got plenty of glucose here. Like, let's just stop pumping glucose out of our liver. So that's what insulin does. It's sort of like it's a conductor, right? It kind of tells your body what it should be doing at a given time. So insulin resistance is your body is not properly utilizing insulin how it should be. So if you actually look at like people with type 2 diabetes, we see a couple things, and we'll get a little bit deeper on this in a minute. But one is, obviously, you have impaired glucose uptake out of your blood, right? So you don't get, it takes more insulin to get glucose out of your bloodstream into your peripheral tissue. But your liver is also not getting the same signal from insulin, so it's pumping out more glucose than it should be. So you kind of get a two. Remember that game when we were as a kid? Let's play 2 hits. I'll hit you. You hit the ground. It's kind of the same thing when you have insulin resistance. Is you're not taking up glucose from circulation, and you're pumping too much into it from your liver. So that's
double whammy there.
Yeah. So that's what insulin itself does. It helps direct substrates, and it tells your body whether you're fed or fasted.
So do people who are insulin resistant, do they have a glucagon problem as well?
They have a inappropriate utilization of glucagon problem. Like, their body is not getting the signal from insulin to tell glucagon not to do what it's supposed to do. So if you actually look at like hepatic glucose output in people with insulin resistance, it's much higher.
Yeah, so I guess my question is more of like, since we know that people with, like, if your body's not secreting enough insulin, or let's just say let's say it has to put out more insulin than normal because you are insulin resistant. Does that also affect the output of glucagon from your liver? Like, do we
Yes.
see? Okay,
Yeah.
so it's okay. Gotcha.
Yes.
So how would we know? Do you want to dive into? Well, I've kind of two different ways I think we should go. One, we could talk about like, how do you know if you have it? How do you know if, like, if you're developing, like, what would be some signs to, hey, I'm becoming insulin resistant? We can touch on that. Or the other thing I'm curious about is, what are the differences between, like, is there a difference between I've got insulin resistance, or I'm pre-diabetic, or I straight up have type 2 diabetes?
So before we go to the like diagnostic criteria, let's start at like, what is insulin resistance as a process? We're often told, and this is kind of where what is true and what we're told is often different. We're often told that high blood sugar or elevated blood sugar leads to insulin resistance, because when you have high blood sugar, your body needs more insulin to be produced, and your body gets tired of the signal. So the theory is like, if I eat a bunch of sugar,
It burns out.
if I eat a bunch of sugar all the time, I have insulin around a lot. My body gets numb to the signal, so it stops working. That
Right.
is actually not even remotely close to what's happening.
Yeah, that's because it makes
So-
sense in your head when you think about that. But that's
So the insulin resistance actually starts inside a cell. So what causes insulin resistance primarily? There's basically 2 or 3 things that are driving insulin resistance. And its most fundamental is in most cases, like I'll talk about some edge cases here in a minute, but in most cases, it's an energy overload problem. So you have too much energy inside your cells for a long period of time. And so what happens is, like, normally, let's just take a muscle cell, for example. Inside your muscle cell, you have stores of carbohydrates and as glycogen. You have stores of fatty acids as intramuscular triglycerides. And your body's always burning that and then bringing stuff in. And so when you're in a extended calorie surplus for a long time, your body can shuttle quite a bit of that excess energy into your fat tissue, is where it's stored, right? But it's also going to try to push some of it into your muscle tissue and your organs. And at some point, you start to exceed a normal. So your fat tissue has this ability to expand. The cells get bigger and bigger, right? Because they can store lipids. Your muscle tissue, not so much. Like, the individual cells, outside of getting bigger from like hypertrophy and building more contractile tissue, they kind of have a limited ability to store fatty acids. And so what happens is, as you kind of have this extended ability to store things and you exceed it, the things coming into your cells, especially the fat, starts to get stored as things that are not normally stored as fat. And that starts to cause issues in the metabolism of the cell. And so those issues actually manifest as insulin resistance. So your cells are starting to say, I mean, I'm personifying a cell, it doesn't say anything specifically. But it's starting to say, dude, I have way too much stuff. Stop sending stuff in. So this is its kind of biochemical way of saying that. So on the inside of your cell, the insulin receptor actually changes. And it's like, dude, stop sending me stuff. So then the body's like, well, I don't want this in the blood. So take it. So they just your body starts producing more insulin. And then your cells keep ratcheting up the insulin resistance because they're like, stop, 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 stop. So it actually happens from the inside. And so this excess energy results in things like oxidative stress inside your cell and inflammation in the body. And both of those things can contribute to insulin resistance. So it actually starts inside the cell. And so then your body starts manufacturing more insulin to offset this resistance to keep blood sugar levels and fatty acid levels normal, but eventually you just can't keep up. And so this is when you start to see blood sugar levels rise and you start to see other things go haywire. So if you actually look at, and I'm going to show you guys a chart here, if we follow like the actual natural history of like type 2 diabetes, which is insulin resistant when it reaches a disease state where we diagnose it, this is exactly what we see from clinical like lab data. So I'm going to show a graph here and I'll kind of explain it. No, hold on. Share screen. Okay. So this is kind of the start, normal. This bottom line is blood sugar, blood glucose. As you develop insulin resistance, so you start to gain body weight, you're in an energy overload state for extended periods of time, your beta cells, so the cells in your pancreas that produce insulin, start to work overtime. Like they start working way harder. And so they can compensate for this insulin resistance for quite a long time. And so your blood sugar stays stable despite you having levels of insulin resistance, right? Because our body's like, hey, I'm just going to produce more insulin and it's going to offset this issue. Until your body can't produce any more insulin. And then the actual production of it starts to go down. And I'll talk about this in a little bit. And so now you can't overcome the insulin resistance. So you start to see blood sugar increase. All right. So the picture I painted of it starts in the cell and your body tries to compensate. We know that from like molecular biology data. And we also see that same process manifest in clinical data. But so what's interesting is by the time blood glucose levels start to increase above normal, the process has been going on for a while and you've been insulin resistant for a while. And so it's actually true that it's not high blood sugar causes insulin resistance, it's insulin resistance causes high blood sugar. Now, this whole concept of like your body gets fatigued from producing insulin, so you're not producing enough. What actually happens is as this process of insulin resistance continues and increases, and as you're asking your body to produce more and more insulin, what's happening is the same processes that happen inside your muscle cells or your liver cells also happen in the beta cells of your pancreas. So they start to experience things like oxidative stress and lipid infiltration. And so what happens is those cells, those insulin producing cells, start dying. So this is why late stage diabetes often has impaired insulin function. Because if you do this long enough, your body's like, oh, my insulin producing cells have been dwindled down to very little.
So I have a question because first of all, your kind of, the way you explained what causes it or what it is, I think is very illustrative and I think it's makes sense to everybody, especially the way you personified it. However, one of the questions that I have that I don't particularly understand is the process by which you described how people become insulin resistant and how they develop diabetes, prediabetes. And that you said, hey, most of the time it's because it's an energy overload thing, right? So why, if that's the case, why isn't it that every time someone becomes overweight, they're insulin resistant? Like, how can there be people that are overweight, maybe even obese, that aren't necessarily insulin resistant yet? Like, what's going on there?
Let me paint an analogy. Well, I'll start with the explanation and then I'll give you an analogy. What's been really interesting is we've kind of learned is everybody has a different threshold for how much extra energy they can take before insulin resistance starts to really manifest. Think about it like everybody has a different capacity in their own life to do stuff, right? Like Elon Musk, whatever you think of him, obviously can work 20 hours a day for 15 years and not burn out and die, right? Some people, if they work 50 hours a week, they burn out and die. I'm saying die like that's a joke.
I know what
They
you mean.
actually die.
Sure.
But like everybody has a different capacity, right? And so some people have a much larger metabolic capacity to take extra energy before stuff starts to break down, right? It's sort of like if you take a bunch of people and you put them in basic training in the military and you have them all do the same thing, some of them get sick, some of them develop shin splints and end up with stress fractures. Some people don't, even though they're exposed to the exact same thing. It's like some people's capacity is just different than others, whether it's, genetic, whether it's just like how they were raised, whether it's their physical fitness level. Like there's a lot of different factors that go into it, but everybody has a different threshold.
Okay. What's the biggest thing that would determine that threshold? Is it lifestyle?
I think a lot of it's like genetics and
Okay.
total physical activity, I think, are the two biggest ones.
But overall, as a general, I mean, would it be fair to say that in general, the more overweight you become, the more at risk you are for developing this?
Yeah, and so if you look at a chart, I mean, you can just Google this. Just look up insulin resistance risk by BMI. You basically see it's a linear.
Gotcha. Right.
It's fairly linear. Now,
Okay.
the actual manifestation of this is a little more complicated. So what actually happens is in the early stages of like energy overload, most of the insulin resistance is coming from inside the cell, right? But as you accumulate body adiposity, your body starts to produce inflammation, like especially your visceral adipose tissue. Kind of systemic inflammation will then on the outside of the cell also cause insulin resistance. Right? This is the reason why like one of the things that happens when people have sepsis, so they have a bacterial infection of their blood, they become massively insulin resistant. And so one of the things that often happens clinically in people with sepsis, is they're given insulin because their blood glucose goes up because they become massively insulin resistant. It's also the reason why they become acidotic, right? When you have massive insulin resistance, your fatty acid oxidation goes down, it's impaired, and you start relying heavily on glycolysis. So you're producing more acid. So this is why you get metabolic acidosis in sepsis. Now, here's what's interesting. We know that, right? Like that is a clinical finding. But from a lot of times, most people think that you have a glucose metabolism problem when you have insulin resistance.
But
what we actually see from the data is we actually see fatty acids are impaired. Fatty acid oxidation is impaired. So I better fix these lines. They're supposed to be connected to this little circle. We're just going to do this live. But realistically,
that was the next thing I was going to ask you about, though, too, because this part always interested me. It was one of those things that when I learned it, was like, oh, it's not what you would traditionally think of. It's just not. You don't think of it that way.
So when you have insulin resistance, and let's say it's fairly advanced and it's type 2 diabetes, here's what's actually happening in your peripheral tissue. Like let's just take your muscle tissue. You actually take up more fatty acids. You take up less carbohydrates. But inside your muscle cells, you are burning less fat. So you have your fat oxidation is impaired. This is related to mostly mitochondrial health and things like that. You increase your carbohydrate oxidation and you increase the fat storage inside your muscle tissue. So it's actually, at its basic level, it's opposite of what most people think. Most people think, oh, I can't burn carbohydrates. It's like, no, your cells are burning more carbohydrates, but your body's not shoving it from your bloodstream into your peripheral tissue like it should.
So is there a difference between having like the stage where you're starting to become insulin resistant and pre-diabetes? Is it the same thing?
It's all on a spectrum, right? And so it's kind of like, where do you fall on that chart? And so this is one of the hard parts about like the diagnostic criteria. I mean, diagnosing a disease is always binary, like you have it or you don't, right? But the reality is, in something like type 2 diabetes, you're on this scale of insulin resistance from none to a lot. And so we kind of just set clinical markers like this is pre-diabetes.
Gotcha.
This is type 2 diabetes. So like, I'd have to go double check, but the like diagnostic criteria, depending on whether you use A1C or like oral glucose tolerance test or a fasting glucose, is like one number. So you could be
So
one
is there
below or one above, and it's you have it or you
Yeah.
don't. But that's not really how the process works. But we do have to we clinically have to figure out definitions.
So that was going to be my question: is do we use a singular diagnostic tool to say yes you are diabetic or no you're not, or is it like multiple like different ways that we have to take into account and then figure it out from there?
It's been so long since I've looked at like what the ICD requirements are, but generally speaking, they will use an HbA1c, which is a glycated hemoglobin, or they will use a fasting glucose. And generally, to be diagnosed, you have to have like 2 fasting glucose levels repeated X amount of days apart to confirm it. Now, if you're a really good practitioner, you would probably do an A1C and a fasting glucose, and I would look at your fasting insulin levels as well.
Here's what's interesting to me. I won't take too much time on this, but I thought it was worth mentioning. When my wife was pregnant with, like, it was either my second or third child out of 500. But when she was pregnant, they said she was what kind of had gestation. Yeah. And it only happened once, but what was weird to me was that in order to test for it, they basically said, hey, you need to come in, don't eat anything for the day, and then we're going to feed you like basically pure glucose, right? And that's what they do. But it's like, and I know they have a reason for doing this, but like, what do you expect when someone is completely fasted and you give them pure glucose? Like, doesn't that just like throw the meter? Like, of course it's going to be like, oh wow, this is and then you get a high reading. Is that it? Must be how that's designed. But like when you go from not eating anything to just pure glucose, it's like, well, what do you think was going to happen? I mean, so in a non,
that's how they do.
Just,
yeah, I mean that's a fairly common diagnostic tool. So they'll also do that in non gestational diabetes tests. So like the oral glucose tolerance test was what it's called. They basically just have you tested, just see how much glucose can your body take and how much insulin you produce. Now, like gestational diabetes is quite a bit different than type 2, like regularly.
For sure.
It's like, one's primarily related to energy overload and it's chronic. Gestational diabetes is mostly related to like, you've got elevated sex hormones. You have, cortisol production's a little bit different. Your beta cells function a little bit differently. So your body's producing a little less insulin than normal. So it's like all those things. Now,
so that's just an acute state that ends up going away after you're not pregnant anymore and those hormones aren't present things generally, right?
It should.
Yeah.
So this was really funny. Before my wife took that test, I was like, hey, you know what you should do is you should not, because you don't truly have to be fasted. But so I had her drink a whey protein shake like an hour before we went in.
Okay.
Because 1, you won't feel as bad. And 2, protein also elicits an insulin response. And so like an hour before your test, you have a fairly high insulinogenic protein source. So you don't have any blood sugar. Like you don't have any blood glucose entering from your food, but you can kind of preload your body with insulin and then drink all the glucose. It keeps it lower. So, and there's actually papers on that. I found a paper. She was like, really? Because I just said, hey, honey, I think you should do this. And she's like, really? I was like, yeah, let me go just make sure there's research to support it. And it turns out there's a couple papers that like they've tested how preloading an oral glucose tolerance test with protein in pregnant women affects the results. And I was like, let's just do this. Because
when I'm out there in July, I'm totally going to tell Marissa that I know she cheated on her oral glucose tolerance test.
She didn't cheat it. She just like, it's like if you're doing your body comp test, it's like, don't go in starving. Like,
fair. I'm going to have to give her a hard time. I mean, she gives me a hard time about a car that I never stole. So I just gotta, give it back. Okay. So what, Yeah, I mean, we've covered a lot already, but what we've talked about, like what causes it. Can we dive into a little bit about one thing I mentioned earlier is the how does the food that we eat affect this? And then the way we live our life in terms of our activity level, being sedentary versus actually being active, right? Let's talk about how those things affect it. And then from there, how can we live in a way that ensures that we're not at risk for insulin resistance and diabetes. With the obvious fact that again, I think people can infer based on what we've talked about that just having a normal body weight is your best bet. But like, what else do we need to know?
The first advice is choose your parents wisely, right? Like have good genetics.
Yes,
That's a joke.
easy
But
to
yeah.
control.
So, I mean, physical activity is a huge piece, and that's not just structured exercise. Just like how much you move in a day matters a lot. Because what happens is when you don't move very much, the flux of nutrients that goes out of your muscle tissue is very low. So like let's say you've accumulated a bunch of stuff in there to like clean up the inside of your muscle cells. I mean, I'm using some fairly vague terms here, but like physical activity helps that whole intracellular environment. It lowers the overall storage of nutrients. It lowers the amount of nutrients that are stored improperly. It decreases oxidative stress. It decreases inflammation, like all of the things that contribute to insulin resistance. Physical activity is a huge component to reducing that. The next piece is sleep. Like poor sleep is a big component, mostly from a hormonal standpoint, and like how insulin functions. And then stress management is also a huge piece. So those are kind of the primary lifestyle things. Now, when we talk about like food and food quality, there are a few things to consider. I mean, we know it's primarily an energy balance issue. So the first thing is like choose a diet that reduces your likelihood of that you're going to eat. You're going to overeat your energy balance equation over an extended period of time. That's the first piece. The second piece is there does appear to be some evidence that foods that have a lot of refined products in them, whether it's like super refined processed foods, may increase levels of oxidative stress and inflammation. Now, that's secondary to making sure you have a healthy body weight. So, just like trying to eat more like minimally processed foods is probably going to reduce risk. It's not a big effect, but it's probably there. And then the third thing is, depending on how you look at this, the total amount of like high glucose foods you consume may impact some of the clinical measures we use for determining type 2 diabetes. So, for example, glycated hemoglobin, HbA1c, is one of the tests that we use to diagnose type 2 diabetes, right? And HbA1c it basically gives you a measure of the average blood glucose level you've had over the last 90 days or so. So if you're like eating a relatively high carbohydrate, high glucose diet, and you eat fairly consistently, like you eat several times a day, you may see slightly higher HbA1c levels just because you had a little bit more glucose present in your blood more frequently. But that doesn't necessarily correlate with the insulin resistance. So you would probably want to get that like confirmed with a fasting glucose and an insulin test. So it's like there are things about your diet that can affect a clinical test that aren't necessarily reflective of underlying pathophysiology, right? So those are the big things that you can do. Now, there is a really interesting phenomenon that's related but not quite related, is when you go through menopause, your A1C level is going to go up regardless of changes in insulin signaling, because the half-life of, or the average life of a red blood cell in a woman pre-menopause and post-menopause is different. It's much longer post-menopause.
Yeah.
So it's been around longer to accumulate glycation or sugar basically attaching to the red blood sugar. So a lot of times we see women, they'll be like, hey, I'm still as healthy as I was, but my A1C went up by 0.2, 0.3. It's like, well, that's because this happened, right? It's the same reason why a lot of times you'll see if people go from not exercising to like engaging in heavy endurance exercise, their A1C may drop because they have shorter red blood cell life, because the endurance exercise can cause red blood cell turnover. Like they get damaged, your body produces more, like because you have increased erythropoietin production. So it's like it's a clinical measure that can change based on things not related to insulin resistance.
What's the healthy threshold for A1C? 7 and lower?
Oh, it's much lower than that now.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, let me pull up the diagnostic criteria.
4?
It is. So the low end of normal is 4. I think like 6
high end 7?
is considered the high end of good. I'd have to go look. I haven't looked at
it probably changed over the decades and
yeah.
Okay. So you touched on something I wanted to talk about, because most of the people that are in our group, most of our clients, probably most of the people that are watching and listening to this podcast are women. So obviously, menopause is, and especially because a lot of the people that I just mentioned are kind of in that age range, anywhere from 35 to, in their 50s and 60s and beyond. But I mean, there's a lot of women that are kind of in that range where they're either premenopause, or they're like, hey, I'm in menopause now, and like, here's what's happening. So this is definitely a real thing on their minds. And so I wanted to dive into that. Like, how does the and you don't have to get too technical, but should women be more concerned about how concerned should women be about insulin resistance, about developing diabetes when they are in menopause? Like, do they need to live drastically different? I mean, how different should they be?
No, I mean, I think it's the recommendations I would give somebody pre and post are the same.
Okay.
Right? So nothing fundamentally changes in terms of how your body's going to be handling food, exercise, etc. in terms of like from the insulin resistance standpoint. Now, does the change in the hormonal profile affect things? Definitely. But you don't have a massively increased risk. The big factor that increases the risk is the reduction in physical activity that's associated with the transition through that phase of life.
So once again, it comes down to just
and it is primarily the physical activity. Like, it's not necessarily the calorie in the food intake. It's what we see in the literature is primarily the reduction in physical activity. And it's probably related to just the fact that you don't feel great.
Okay. So the other thing that comes up a lot from women in our group and our clients is PCOS. So is it that is it becoming insulin resistant or developing diabetes leads to PCOS or makes it worse? Or is it like the other way around? If you have PCOS, you're more likely to become insulin resistant. Like, I mean, I don't understand the correlation there, but I think there is one. So what does that look like?
So it's definitely the case that it is the initial issue is that the PCOS condition itself affects insulin signaling.
Okay.
And then the results of the insulin resistance and the hyperinsulinemia and the changes in metabolic stuff then cause, like, it's kind of like a feed forward loop where it's like you start doing things, your body starts storing stuff improperly, and so then it starts to become more insulin resistant that way. Now,
I have a question, if I could.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, is this because is PCOS like, is that because it's considered sort of an inflammatory thing, and when you have inflammation, things happen to your hormones, and therefore insulin is affected? Is that I'm probably speaking like at very surface level like terms, but is that why? Like, it's causing inflammation in your body? and it sends out inflammation markers, inflammatory markers.
There's a whole lot of stuff going on. Like it's hormonal, it's due to the inflammation, it's due to the changes in the metabolic environment. And what's interesting is it's been a while since I've read this literature, so we may have some updates. Is there appears to be like different phenotypes. So like 10 women can be diagnosed with PCOS, and they're all going to have slightly different phenotypes of like some respond really well to X interventions, some respond really well to Y interventions, some have like certain hormone dominant PCOS versus others. And so I think it's like a relatively, like there's a lot of variance within that diagnosis.
Gotcha.
And I am not a PCOS expert.
Let's dive in. This is another part I really wanted to dive into because I think it's huge. We've talked about heart disease before. But how does this, what's the correlation there? Or is it just because is the correlation we're overweight and we know that becoming overweight has impacts on your heart, so you're more likely to develop heart disease? Because I'm guessing that, I mean, like I said, we've done a lot of these episodes where you kind of just start to piece things together, right? And I think at the end of the day, what it really comes down to is the more sedentary you are, the more body weight you gain, the more at risk for just diseases overall that you accumulate, right? So you become more at risk for insulin resistance, you become more at risk for heart disease. So these things just kind of go together, right? So there's that, and I also know that, so there's impact on your brain too, your brain function. There can be cognitive decline. So like there's just this whole, like, being overweight and sedentary just in general doesn't seem to be too healthy for us, right? So it seems like when you become insulin resistant or you become diabetic, it seems to me like you're at risk for other diseases as well. Again, heart disease being one of them. So do we often see people who are diabetic also having heart issues? Like, hey, it looks like you have heart disease too, whether that's atherosclerosis or whatever. Do they often go hand in hand?
So let's just focus on the heart. Mostly because I've spent more time on that than the brain. In fact, I've spent almost enough time on the brain. So it is true that with increased BMI, you get increased risk of heart disease for things completely unrelated to insulin resistance / type 2 diabetes. You get blood pressure, right? Increased blood pressure can cause things with the heart. You get ectopic fat deposits, so you get like fat being deposited in certain parts of your heart, which affects electrical conductivity and metabolism, etc. There's also something very interesting that occurs in the heart when you have insulin resistance. So it's been so long since I've thought about this that I'm going to screw it up. So your heart metabolizes things slightly differently than the rest of your body. And I gotta look this up real quick, so I don't screw this up.
That's okay. Here, I'll do this.
When you are in utero, your heart metabolizes fat and carbohydrates differently than when you're born and you become an adult. You have this set of genes, and part of that is related to, with this different metabolism, the like structure of your heart and it being built and laying down muscle tissue occurs in utero, right? When you become insulin resistant, one of the things that happens is the heart is you actually get a reactivation of those genes from being in utero, and it's called the fetal gene program. And so what that does is it also kicks off the signaling related to that. So your heart actually starts to turn on like the heart muscle building genes. And so you actually start to lay down more muscle tissue. So diabetic cardiomyopathy is a disease where you have changes in like heart metabolism. So the ratio of carbohydrates to fat burned at rest is different. And you actually then start to also lay down more cardiac muscle tissue. Now you think like, oh, more muscle tissue in your heart's good. No, it actually turns out what happens is as you build thicker and thicker heart walls, you get less space in your heart for the blood to come in. So you get less blood volume with each heart. And then your heart isn't able to expand as much and contract as much. So it's basically like, you know, have you ever like gone to the gym and had a big pump and like you can barely reach the seatbelts in your car? Your heart kind of experiences that, right? It can't contract as much. And so you get diabetic cardiomyopathy. So in addition to the blood pressure issues from having obesity, you actually get a change in metabolism and the architecture of your heart. And so the lab I did my postdoc in, that's what we focused on.
What was your favorite part about the lab work that you used to do? Like, was there a particular aspect that you really enjoyed the most when you were doing all this stuff?
Man, so much of it was pretty cool. I think one of my favorite parts was like we got to like genetically engineer mice, which was pretty cool, and then we got to do mouse surgery, which was pretty cool. So
Mouse
that was
surgery.
pretty fun.
Nice.
But I think like the wildest thing is like you can spend a year and a half doing all this crazy stuff. Like you genetically engineer a mouse, you give it some sort of intervention, you take the tissue, you like run it through all these chemical processes, you run it through all this molecular biology stuff, and then you basically just get numbers on a spreadsheet that are like data in a graph and a paper. And you're just like, the whole process is so bizarre. You're like, all of this stuff is, this number says 6 and this number says 10 means all of these things that happened. Like I remember when I wrote a paper and I was like doing the graphs and I was like, this graph is 10 years or 10 months of my life. And you're just like, that's so depressing, but also kind of crazy at the same time.
How do you this? Man, I don't know how complicated this answer is going to be, but like, how do you genetically engineer or alter a mouse's DNA? Is it just I got to draw some blood and then I got to do some other stuff and then inject the blood back? Like, what does just high level?
It's there's a whole lot of different ways you can do it, but what usually happens is you can like engineer the DNA in like the egg cell of a mouse and then implant it. So you basically like clone a mouse and engineer its DNA, and then you can breed it with other mice. So you get like the crossbreeding. Remember the like Punnett squares from Mendel, and then you like do selective breeding and you can genotype them and then breed them with somebody else. And so you can use a combination of like gene editing and selective breeding to like get a specific genotype you want. But then there's also cool things where like you can genetically engineer a mouse so that it has a normal genome basically until you give it something like environmental, like some exposure, and then it'll activate something that cuts out the gene. So like it can be totally normal until you give it like a certain antibiotic or you give it a certain drug.
Here's a wild one for you. How long until we can genetically engineer people to no longer be diabetic?
Type 1 or type 2?
Let's say both.
Well, type 1, we've already started to do that.
Okay.
Type 2, I think that's almost impossible.
Really? Okay. But type 1, and type 1 presumably we are doing that already because the DNA is already in there and we know what to identify and what to change.
Sort of. So this is, and I may get some of the details here slightly wrong because it's been so long since I've looked into this, but so type 1 diabetes is completely different, right? Type 2 diabetes is a disease of impaired insulin signaling. Type 1 diabetes is a disease of insulin insufficiency. So your body just doesn't produce anymore. So basically, in most cases of type 1 diabetes, it's the result of an autoimmune disease. So they get some sort of event that happens where their body attacks the pancreas, the islet cells of their pancreas, the insulin producing cells of their pancreas, and it kills them. And so their body doesn't produce insulin anymore, right? So that's how type 1 diabetes generally happens and manifests. But what we can do, and I haven't looked at the status of these trials, it turns out that there's actually nothing super important about the pancreas and like the cells that produce the insulin being there. Like it doesn't have to be there. They can kind of be anywhere. It's just like that's where they evolved to be. Probably because a lot of the other enzymes are there, and it's like it's exposed to the food as it goes through our blood, through our body. But what you can do is you can take like a scraping of your own skin cells. You can engineer them to go backwards in their evolution to become stem cells. This is called induced pluripotency. So you can actually like unage your cells backwards to be pluripotent stem cells. Then we can turn on the genes in those cells that make them the insulin producing beta cells, and then we can just re-inject them into your body.
That's crazy. Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah.
Huh. So any reason why this isn't like mainstream yet, like in like just a standard treatment? Is it just too
it's going through
complicated to...
huge amounts of trials right now. Cell biology and doing it at scale is really hard.
How much do you think AI is going to accelerate our abilities in this area?
A lot. And mostly it'll accelerate
like the research part,
the screening processes, because it can like read. Because what you have to do is you have to like basically like genotype all the cells that come out of this manufacturing, and it's really hard to do. Like it just takes a ton of time.
Like months or years.
Yeah.
For a human to do, that AI can then condense down into what, probably days or weeks.
Yeah, it's sort of like the advancement of technology and machine learning, like early AI. It allowed us to do things called high throughput screening. So what like old drug development used to involve basically like a bunch of people thinking about some stuff and then spending 20 years trying to find a target to do it, and then spending another 20 years finding
doing it,
something that will actually target that receptor in the body.
Yeah.
And now through either like physical high throughput screening, where they can just like take a library of 10,000 small molecules and like run all these tests simultaneously, like with big machines, accelerates the testing process. But we're actually getting to the point where now we can actually simulate a lot of these things. Like we know what causes certain receptors to get turned on. And so you can actually like synthetically, like in silico, make antibodies that target those things, test them, and be like, oh, we think this is going to work. It's sort of like
that's wild.
Did you ever see the movie, oh god, The Tomorrow War, I think, with
Chris Pratt?
Like, you know how she was like screening all those things?
Yeah.
Kind of works like that now.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. Have you read about this stuff? Like, is this stuff you try to keep up on?
I mean, we used to do this work, but I haven't been in the lab in 7 years. So, but I try to keep up on as much as I can when I'm not trying to get people to sign up for coaching, which go to macrosinc.net, sign up for coaching.
I wanted to take one last minute to just thank everyone for watching. And if anyone has any questions, you might have some time to pop it in there. We could probably answer real quick, but time's running out. So tick, tick, tick tock.
Time is running out. Number 4.
Is there anything else you'd like to add? Anything else you think people should know about this entire topic? Insulin resistance. What was funny to me is we mentioned, like, there was a couple times throughout the show we literally said the word insulin resistance, and I'm drinking a Pepsi, which is the well, it's a zero sugar Pepsi, but it's the
Pepsi, not Coke.
I'll just drink whatever is in the fridge. I'm not. It's whatever. So, but yeah, it's just kind of funny because it's like the stereotypical. You're talking about insulin resistance and diabetes, and here's this dude drinking a pop. It's like, or soda, as some people call it. Just kind of thought that was comical. But it doesn't look like we have any questions, so I guess we can duck out of here. Nobody wants to talk to us. So
Cool. Adios.
I appreciate everyone watching. Thank you all so much. And we will be back next week with another fantastic episode for you. So we're going to duck out of here. That's it. Toodaloo.